today. The audience that it's written for is assumed to have somewhat of an understanding of economics. So if there's just a couple things about capitalism that aren't discussed to the full extent, it's because I'm assuming that. So the format of this presentation is I'm going to read this, and it should be about 10-15 minutes, somewhere around that is what I'm going for, and then afterwards we just have an open discussion. So that's what conference is in Cuba, and that's the way I'd like to have this presentation. So let's discuss the actual topic. If there's anything about the presentation itself that you think would be better, I'd like you to do that. So, without further ado, the transnational capitalist class. Since the 1970s, the world has been going through a socio-economic transformation known as globalization. The existence of this phenomenon is widely accepted. Global capitalism appears to be its driving force. The trend is seen not as the cause, but as the consequence of capitalist development. Modes of production have been fragmented and decentralized as capitalists have integrated global systems specifically designed around the pursuit of maximum profit accumulation. This has resulted in the creation of a global ruling class, hereafter referred to as the transnational capitalist class. We'll just call that TCC. Transnational refers to forces, processes, and institutions that cross borders, but do not derive power directly from one state. Now, most critics of globalized capitalism portray it as an impersonal force which ordinary people and sometimes entire nations can do nothing to impact. As the economist William Robinson said, this is both empirically false and morally fatalistic. The system itself is dependent upon mass consent, and there are identifiable actors driving globalization. The TCC is made up of individually and interlocking groups including transnational capitalist corporations and financial institutions, mass media conglomerates, powerful political and bureaucratic, professional and technical entities, supranational economic planning agencies. Supranational is made up of nations, so it's above nations, but it's made up of nations. So let's stop with this. Transnational corporations. Transnational corporations, TNCs, are at the forefront of global capitalist expansion. The other components of the TCC actively support these corporations, making them the central factor. Without a global economy dominated by powerful globalizing corporations, the TCC itself could not exist. The main characteristics of these TNCs is their ceaseless pursuit of maximum return on capital investment. Corporations are formally owned by millions of individual shareholders whose main interest is in seeing the value of their investments increase. And the sole purpose for business exists not within the confines of their respective industries, but with the realization of profit. Maximum return on investment is the lifeblood of capitalism, and the details of how profits are generated are inconsequential, even when the sustainability of the system itself is put into question. Effective control of these corporations is usually vested in small groups of owner executives and institutional shareholders, most of whom are members of the TCC. The personnel comprising these distinct groups are fairly interchangeable, with well-connected individuals moving from one position of power to the next. Interchangeable personnel shows how interconnected the global capitalist system is. Classism. A simple example can be found in the Bush administration. George Bush, oil tycoon and president of the most powerful capitalist country. Dick Cheney, vice president and former chairman and CEO of the global infrastructure company Halliburton. And Paul Wolfowitz, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense and president of the World Bank. These relationships represent potential conflict of interest as well as show how interconnected the TCC is. Bureaucratic agencies. The TCC props up politicians in capitalist countries via powerful lobby groups and generous campaign contributions given to candidates that promote the interests of the class. In this way, the class can legally bribe political leaders. It's commonplace to argue that in the age of capitalist globalization, in most countries, political parties rarely make any significant differences because no political party that seriously challenges capitalist globalization stands much chance of being elected. For example, the United States political system is comprised of two ideologically opposing political parties, but both of them actively and overwhelmingly support global capitalism. Supranational bureaucratic organizations promote the interests of global capitalism by providing access to large loans while guiding economic reforms for developing and struggling countries. Examples of such agencies include the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Economic Forum. These agencies provide funding for nations in need, along with mandatory structural changes promoting neoliberal economic and trade reforms. They systematically promote the suppression of national protectionism and the creation of free trade zones, providing access to capital on the condition that borrowing nations open themselves up to capitalist globalization. The media. Mainstream mass media conglomerates, often privately owned, effectively disseminate and spin information to increasingly misinformed populace. In this way, the globalizing ideology of the TCC is spread to the masses. These groups achieve significant success in getting across the message that there is no better alternative to global capitalism. Televised programs and printed press actively lead viewers to believe that pro-business policies are necessary and good for the nation, supporting proponents of the TCC and globalizing methods, while dismissing critics of the system. The internet increasingly plays a significant role in spreading information to those with access. Google's "do right" mantra is rhetorically sound, but their ability to limit access to certain information and choose which sites appear through the web engine searches should definitely raise a few eyebrows. How the TCC operates. Members of the TCC are aware of their existence as a global class, as well as the fact that they are far better organized than the working class. They do not act alone, but together through interconnected channels webbed around the world. Their control over the most significant economic resources allows them to further their interests in ways not accessible to the vast majority of the world. Military interventions by means of nations that are loyal to the TCC have proven to be extremely useful and profitable to the global class. Interventions effectively extend market activities by opening up and protecting regional markets for the TNCs, generally crushing opposition forces in an effort to stabilize global economic activity. Prolonged occupations tend to be quite profitable for powerful industries, including firms specializing in armament, infrastructure, and key natural resources. However, such interventions generally occur only when coercive means are exhausted. The TCC generally prefers to operate through a culture of manipulation and intimidation that forces cooperation. The justification for an inherent problem in globalization. Globalization is not the cause but the consequence of capitalist development. It is necessary for contemporary capitalism because of the declining rate of profit a closed contained economic system generates. Mechanisms like expansion and intensified worker production can combat this decline, but restrictions like unions limit intensified production. In an effort to maximize profits, capitalists have responded by expanding globally. Free trade policies open the door to transnational capital in new ways, providing the capitalist class with the opportunity to extend their profit margins. The clear message coming out of most global capitalist firms is that global expansion became necessary for the survival of the company. An important part of economic globalization is how modes of production have become increasingly fragmented and decentralized. The global division of labor builds flexibility into the system. Capital can migrate worldwide in search of the cheapest source of labor, limiting the number of workforces that can decisively hold capital to ransom by good jobs. In this way, domestic wages for workers are suppressed in capitalist countries. The focus of workplace control is the threat that jobs will be lost, and in the extreme, the economy will collapse unless workers are prepared to work longer and for less in order to meet foreign competition. Maximum returns drives the system, and the combination of lower wages and higher prices generates a larger surplus. This pursuit guarantees at best the persistence and at worst the intensification of class polarization on a global scale. So it becomes clear that the problem of social division is not based on policy, but is inherent within the system. National versus global interests. Globalization has a contradictory relationship to the concept of national interest. For the TCC, global goals supersede national interests. transnational corporations have no fundamental loyalty to any of the locations in which they do business. They aim to make money for the company and its shareholders, not the nations they were founded in. They actively work towards creating the political conditions for diverting state support towards major corporations operating within state borders under the rhetorical rallying cry of national competitiveness. Although the conception of global national companies is deeply entrenched in popular thought and academic research, it is a fundamentally false assessment. Transnational corporations conduct much of their business outside the constraints of national borders. To them, siding with a particular nation is a matter of strategic alliance, and when it becomes no longer necessary to support a nation in order to conduct business, ties are easily severed. National politicians are aware of this relationship, but are unable to alter it, as their positions are protected only so far as they represent the capitalist class. This arrangement has created a division within the political system for high-income countries, a contradiction that helps to explain why nation-states have behaved and will continue to behave in unpredictable and inconsistent ways. Impact on developing nations, such as Cuba in this case. Developing nations feel the effects of global capitalism quite acutely. Many of these countries conceive of neoliberalism as the best system for crafting the nation into a globally competitive state, and they insert themselves into a global capitalist system under the guise of competitiveness. Although it is true that economic shocks are usually accompanied by a sharp increase in transnational presence, capitalist reforms are often courted by the powerful entities within developing countries that stand to profit from globalization. The main forces pushing capitalist reforms in third world countries are transnational corporations working in collaboration with state officials and the national worker body. Although global companies often stifle the growth of smaller companies in developing nations, many large third world corporations are globalizing to a level that approximate with those of the first world. This undermines the assertion that globalization is strictly a Western imperialist movement. Global capitalist expansion has led to increased economic exploitation of laborers worldwide, but particularly in developing nations, where intensified repression has led to increased strife and instability. Leaders of cooperative nations receive substantial funds from the TCC, which often strengthens the power of ruthless dictators worldwide. Reporting capitalism into third world countries is extremely profitable for the TCC, and the actual type of government ruling these new markets is only relevant when trying to ascertain how stable the markets will be over time. Capital maintains no allegiance, and all nations, developed or otherwise, should expect the TCC to act accordingly. Sustainability. There are growing concerns regarding the sustainability of global capitalism. TNCs are skilled at picking up on trends, and thus it is no surprise that concepts like going green are expressed as primary goals, regardless of the overwhelming evidence indicating otherwise. Our environment is undergoing a period of potentially catastrophic change as capitalism actively promotes the blatant disregard of ecological sustainability, all in the name of business. Global capitalism survives by expanding and devouring all useful resources. This is an unsustainable strategy, and the fact that the TCC resorts to coercive tactics indicates their awareness of how potentially unpopular this arrangement would be if exposed. It appears that we are hurtling towards a breaking point, and it seems unlikely any significant change will originate within the system itself. Opposition and conclusion. The current form of global economic exchange is not a fair or sustainably viable system for the majority of human beings. It is dominated by a highly organized, resourceful, and monopolizing hierarchy that appears to be unstoppable. Yet, it is of utmost importance to recognize that we have the capability to effectively shape the path of the future. Resistance to global capitalism is only effective through local disruptions at the moment, since no current social movement appears even remotely likely to overthrow any of the major institutions comprising the TCC. Nevertheless, there is nothing inherently prohibiting local movements from becoming global. Globalization will ultimately free resistance movements from their current regional limits. The dialectics of global capitalist expansion, which has caused so much exploitation, oppression, and misery for the peoples of the world, has in turn created the conditions for its own destruction. Globalization has brought about both the globalized capitalist class and the global working class, setting the stage for a worldwide class struggle between capital and labor. This process will likely continue until either the dramatic collapse of the global system or the rise of a sufficiently unified and organized transnational working class. Workers of the world unite. Well, Google has a program that basically decides what the best for an answer is in search, just based upon the content.
You can pay them.
You can pay them as well. It gives you the right to talk.
Even
You pay
local,
them, bam.
local businesses and advertisers can pay them.
Right there. First one, right there. You pay, you're on the top. Second, the way you word it, and you have the right things, and just link to enough things. Google is a very complicated arrangement, but it's one that they control the program that selects it, and they often alter it and change it up just all the time. It makes a big difference. Chris, you had something about it, right?
I was going to say, like, in my practical experience, too, there's a thing called SEO, which is, like, basically, it's a way of writing things into websites so that Google will find your site faster. But based on doing that or not, you can do what they dislike, which is called black hat SEO. And so, like, Overstock.com, for instance, got busted by that recently. And so Google dropped it. And as of today, I think we're back on, but basically that it like took about 20% out of a lot of like the different like business that site got alone. Which is, I mean, huh? Because if people look for things and they used to throw Overstock.com up above, now they wouldn't. You have to basically go on its own. So basically, it's like they just decided not to punish Overstock to not show it. But I mean, in that same way, they can do that with any content they want, really.
Most people look up the sites that appear on the first page.
Yeah.
Maybe not go to the 12th page.
Google's a verb now, too.
Yeah, actually, I have a contention with the basic thesis of this paper, which is there's a transnational capitalist class. The assumption on this, and it runs throughout the entire paper, is that the transnational corporations have superseded national interests. But that seems to be demonstrably not the case in every single category characterized here. So let me just go through arguably the most important one. The most important one is, as I see it, and I believe as you would see it, would be the financial institutions of capital, right? And so just on the second page, we have the supranational bureaucratic organizations promote the interests of global capitalism by providing access to large loans while guiding economic reforms from developing and struggling countries. Examples of such agencies include, and this is again a point of extreme contention, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Economic Forum. So in order for this thesis to be correct, as I see it, these are core institutions to the central thesis of a transnational capitalist class. But what you'll notice is every single one of those institutions, although they include global capital, have a primary shareholder, and also take the direction of that primary shareholder, which is to say the United States.
I disagree.
Well, I mean, you can disagree, but you'll notice that we don't get...
The president of the world, like, they're not made up of U.S. entities themselves. They're made up of multiple countries. They're not American agencies. Some of them might have American, some of them might have American, like just like I said, Paul Wolfowitz, who's head of the World Bank, right? But that they are made up of multiple countries, and international, like, you know, not supranational agencies. I'm not saying that nations don't exist. Nations definitely exist. You know, we work on within nations. And politics is organized nations. But these are made out of things that are beyond just nations. They go across the world.
Either way. Or do you mind if I respond directly to that?
Sure.
Well, okay, but again, there are key material questions that need to be asked. Who are the primary shareholders of these?
Across the world.
Right, but the majority shareholder of these institutions is the United States Treasury Department. But for example, the World Bank. The United States is the primary shareholder, which means they get the primary amount of votes, which means by and large they carry out American foreign policy. And I mean, you can just go down the list. There are agencies that actually carry out national policy. Media, for example, would be Al Jazeera. True, there is a universal agreement that capitalism and neoliberalism is a great approach, but it's not at all clear that that's due to any transnational capitalist class, but rather the thesis that every individual nation is itself competing to maintain a privileged position over the world economics.
In this case, if this was to be at the conference, I would say in an opportunity to let more people speak, I would like to refer you to the hard copy, where I can provide you a lot more detail. And I would gladly answer a lot of these questions afterwards. But please, let's just have this session. Next.
Well, I just agree with your thesis on that, with smarting and trying to do it. The WTO is made up of the G20 countries, which are the global trade countries that make that the richest people in those countries see, you know, and trying to get into the WTO. So it's a correct thesis that I see.
Can you maybe like expand a little bit of like why if capitalism was more regulated, like why it's still more regulated? These like theories for emotional points.
Sure. Capitalism is a system, it's an ideology that chases capital. So money is the ultimate goal, right? It isn't about social welfare, it's not sustainability. It's about achieving fun. Now, as very complicated. I mean, that's a very tough question.
Yeah, that didn't figure out.
About what, like, where the seeds of economic destruction and all that.
Because I've been hearing a lot of German capitalist theories and socialist and stuff.
Well, first off, social well-being is a byproduct of capitalism. They have a philosophical concept that if we just all pursue money, that ultimately these concepts like the invisible hand, if anybody feels like they can explain it, but they have these concepts like the invisible hand, which is just basically things will equalize, right? The funny part about if things equalize is profit margins go down, you know, because you don't make as much money. But the whole goal is to make money. So then you basically have to arrange it to in a way where you can make money, or by using some rules, it just kind of, you know, there won't be much profit. That's what the declining rate of profit is. And that was the biggest problem back in the 1800s when local farmers were trying to figure out what was going on. It isn't, if you have a system that says you promote trying to get as much money as possible, isn't there something contradictory about it if it results in ultimately having being able to get less and less money from it? It basically sets itself up to
Yeah, I probably, in a way, agree more with Greg on this. Although I do think that as far as when it comes to whether the transnational capitalist class has superseded like national capitalist classes, however, I do think that like it's more global than it ever has been. There's no constant, like the level of globalization is incredible. And the richest person in the world is Carlos Slim from Mexico, you know. I mean, that should say something just right there. But I still think the reason why I think it's important to, in my view, in my own opinion, to see why national capital still is dominant is because, just like Rosa Luxemburg talks about in Reform or Revolution, the globalization of capitalism is really just the inverse of its extreme nationalism, you know. And I think as you see the growth, and I think as we see more and more, there's actually kind of a growing protectionist trade war that's going on, especially between the U.S. and China, while at the same time they have this symbiotic relationship, you know. And I think, in my opinion, I think that like if you see some kind of shutdown between all these different like sectors of the capitalist world, that's what triggered the first, like the Great Depression, you know. That hasn't happened. I think there's so much credit, there's so much money just being pumped into the system. There's so many different things that are kind of keeping the system afloat that hasn't happened, you know. And also, not to mention the extremely cheap labor from, you know, societies that have never been as nearly as capitalist as they are now that can be openly exploited by the superpowers. So I think all these things are factors into it. I do think it's really important, in my opinion, while I don't know if I necessarily agree that the transnational capitalist class has overtaken the national capitalist class, I think globalization is maybe the most important thing for Marxists and for socialists and for everyone, revolutionaries, to grapple with and trying to figure out, because it's really impacted us in a profound way.
You're right about there is also a strife within the capitalist class, because not every capitalist makes their money globally. So there's a little bit of conflict between the ones that make their money just in the nation around across the world. So there is that. But it seems to be that whether it's superseded the national capitalist class at this point yet, it does appear that the trend is becoming more and more global.
Yeah, I was questioning, how would Cuba's government play into correlate to it?
Well, they haven't really been integrated very much at this point, and a lot of it has to do with the U.S. embargo. Right now, they're currently enacting reforms that are opening up more. And it does, it's theorized that once Fidel dies, maybe when Raul dies, that they'll kind of want to do this. It looks like that's
So Cuba's kind of like on the radar, like right for the thinking part. We're seeing Castro kind of checking out.
potentially. Potentially. And so they're trying to, they have a strong background in national protectionism and trying to decide what is the best way to move forward that takes care of the people, but also, helps the country, helps the conflict. They're pretty good country, from what I know. I haven't studied Cuba specifically, so I can't give you all the details on that.
I'd love to talk to you about Cuba before you go. I was there about a year ago from the fund, and I expected to be there like feet up, like seriously, and I was not that way at all. It was very scary and just not at all what I expected based on what I had read. And I feel like my education feels similar to yours as far as that, like that. I don't know. I'd love to talk to you about it before you go. Yeah, and this opening up that's happening when they're like, yeah, go ahead and start your own business. And so, well, then they tax you for 50%, and they're making it impossible to do. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, they've never done it before, so it's scary. People who have started businesses since they opened, like 6 months ago, they opened it up or something like that. They're not doing very well. It's not working at the moment. So, I don't know.
Just as far as your presentation goes, not in the argument, but just a paper, I'm not an economics major, but just looking at this, I think it would really help you to use case studies that you have written.
Yeah.
And undeniable facts that just even tell the story.
Right, no, you're definitely right. And they expect that it's a longer paper, but as they even wrote this, they're like, this is not, how many points can you make just now?
Right.
Straight
I
up.
would say, like, if you could try and put it as, I think it would really help you.
Yeah.
And I would even try and make your pieces clearer at the beginning. I didn't really get what you were trying to say until like the second page. So, yeah.
Take that into consideration. Yeah, that's where it is, it's detail, fix it, and that's what I want to do.
I think it's a good thing, and one of the things that I really liked was the idea that the media present to the consumers that capitalism is the only option. That's something that's true that I never really thought about. But what I wanted to address is, so you're concerned with economic globalization and the transnational capitalist class. I wonder about the purported globalization of civil and political rights, which followed the globalization according to the proponents of economic and social rights. Do these latter, more egalitarian globalization movements fit into what you mentioned in your conclusion, that there is in fact the possibility for the masses to provide some kind of leading force to the economic globalization?
I think it's the only chance we have. I can't afford to say I know the best system. I'm not making any such statements. I think I'm not sure what is the best path forward. I'm just saying that it is possible. I think that my personal feeling is something that's going to have to be socially democratic, and that's going to take in a lot of these different causes. They're ultimately pushing, I think, the same thing for the most part, which is a better way to operate the world. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what way that is. I just think that it has to happen. It should happen. That's I think why we're all in this room right now as revolutionaries. We believe that we can make change. We can, if we unite together, at least provide a platform to do it.
Yeah, you talked about sustainability. Would it be possible to intensify global capitalization or capitalism to the point that would scare even TCC members?
Probably. I don't know, maybe. How far can we be pushed? Yes. Let us know. Anybody else?
I'll bite on something else. You talked at 2 different points about how modes of production have been fragmented and decentralized as part of this globalization movement. And I wonder if that's the case, because you see that market trends are such that there's consolidation in particular industries and across industries. Vertical and horizontal integration, and then there's consolidation of the media companies and this and that. And that sort of, in my mind, jives with the fragmentation don't seem to mesh with that. Can you flesh that out a bit more?
I think what it means is different things. It used to be, you have all, back when it was the Industrial Revolution maybe in this country, let's think about the industrial phase there. You have all the chains of production pretty much right next to each other. They were built in that way. And nowadays, they're all over the world. You can make one thing one place, send it to this place, or have something else made somewhere else, sent to a place in a third country where they put it together, sold to a fourth, things like that. So I think that's preference. I'm not sure exactly what you is that what you meant?
Yeah. But they're all controlled by one entity, right?
Yeah, well, corporation, most production underneath one corporation maybe is that. Corporations might be, they're also international. I think I'm pretty sure that is right. You mean by decentralized? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's...
The production itself for each by corporation is centralized within that corporation. But the actual locations where the production is taking place.
I think he had his hand up.
I'm just going to say, I wonder if you can kind of speak to the idea a little bit, or if you thought about it as with the abstraction of capital, and basically, it's not even on the silver standard, but it's moved into something that's entirely theoretical, that then makes the point of more globalization of this capitalist movement, as opposed to just nationalist capital, when people were just holding, the countries were just holding their gold in their Fort Knoxes or whatnot. And not to say that we don't have those, but just that it doesn't represent the percentage of the capital of the country that it does now. Like you were saying with the modes of production and whatnot, everything was, in a sense, it was all easy to nationalize because it would all be right there. Whereas now it can be anywhere, but no matter where you make your Nike shoes, the Nike dollar, the biggest portion of their dollars will end up in Manhattan. You know what I mean? I don't know.
I defer to everybody else who wanted to answer that question.
What was the actual question?
Yeah, I didn't get it.
Basically, it's amusing on the idea of, as capital has become more theoretical, is that working toward the idea, is that helping aid the fact that it's becoming more global? as opposed to just like seriously like national interests alone.
What's that, Greg?
Can I ask you a qualifying question? When you say capital becoming more abstract, do you mean that the currency and the monetary policy is not based on a form of species, it's not based on gold or silver?
The capital, it's something that's not an object. It's the theoretical concept as opposed to a commodity.
Well, then what I would actually say is, what has happened is capital has become more sophisticated. The reason why it's become more sophisticated is if you base your currency, your monetary policy, on something that's concrete, one of two things happen. Either you run out of that concrete thing, and so you have massive deflation, like say I have only 100 gold bars, but I used to only make 100 products, and now I make 1,000 products. Suddenly there's not enough money to go around, or I start shaving pieces off of that gold, right? And so essentially now I would have 1,000 gold correspond to 1,000 production. Well, the transition is not from gold to abstract, it's a transition from gold to production. Currency isn't abstract, it's not based on nothing or fiat currency. You hear this all the time, our money isn't based on anything. That's not accurate. Instead, it's a much more sophisticated system where it's based on production. So it does make it a little more difficult to cause crises in capitalism, because the crises of capitalism previously were often linked to a lack of monetary funds, either for investment or for buying or for selling. Now it's a little more difficult because it's linked to production, so it's easier for central banks, like the Federal Reserve, like the European Union banks, like the Japanese banks, to control monetary policy, either increase the amount of funds or decrease the amount of funds, so it fits to the actual amount of production that's going.
Yeah.
And so
But I mean, then you still have derivatives on top of that. So, I mean, in a sense, it becomes a step removed from like just it's not like a production equals this amount of currency, because then you have a derivative, so it's like a squared up kind of. I mean, that's when I start to wonder if anything else beyond.
Not really on subject though, is it?
What do you mean?
You know what I mean? Money's money. Fuck it. You know? You know what I mean? I don't mean to interrupt, but that's a different topic, don't you think? Than what Mike's talking about.
It's a philosophical question that ultimately goes back down to what is value based on, you know?
Yeah.
So I mean, then now you're just talking, is it based on labor?
Well, no, but I mean,
it is a good question, but.
Well, yeah, but we're having a discussion about like the theoretical concept of it, and I don't know, I'm interested in where this going at.
What's the point?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily entirely agree with that. I do think that there is quite a bit of fictitious capital in the system. Precisely for, in fact, the financialization of the economy points to that. I think there's like 10 times the amount of money as productive, is warranted by the productive forces that exist. So it seems to me like that's a harbinger of doom. You know, I mean, the reality is that it has to be based on something, or it's eventually going to collapse. In a lot of ways, what happened in 2008 was precisely all this financialization collapsing in on itself. The only way that they were able to stop the whole thing from collapsing under this big mound of sand was by pushing so much sand under it, you know, that when it falls, it's going to just utterly, crumble. So I think, in my view, and maybe it's slightly different from Greg's, I do agree with quite a bit of what Greg is saying. I think there's quite a bit of financialization which is kind of like, it's crazy. It's making money out of nothing. You're literally making, your job is to invent pieces of paper, you know. So, but yeah, I do actually think, in my view, is the fact that they can't use gold, they can't use some of these old standards anymore, precisely shows the depths that capitalism is willing to go in order to make a quick profit to destroy their long-term stability. And the reality is that they really don't have any other choice because of the declining rate of profit. They absolutely have to. So, or I should say the general tendency for the decline in the rate of profit.
I think there's two things to say about this, and maybe this is just an overly classical Marxist approach, but I think Marx put it together pretty well in Das Kapital when he said, when you hold a piece of coin in your hand, you're holding a literally solidified piece of labor. And it's really important that, that's the truth, that's the fetish, right? But it's important that we don't mystify ourselves into other fetishes which causes speculation problems in the market. Because when you do speculate on the market, what you're doing is you're really buying future labor and what that might be worth in the future. So we should not be very confused as to whether or not the species, again, covered in, I believe it's in wage, labor, and capital very clearly as well, right? It's C to M to C, right? The money is merely just the house of that, and gold was merely just the house
C
of
means
that.
commodity and then
Right.
money.
Yeah, commodity, money, commodity, right? And we have the previous forms. So there's that. Tying that back to the conversation, when we're looking at both an imperialistic model or this sort of national capitalist class, international capitalist class, it's compatible with both of them. So for instance, if India is producing a whole bunch of labor for us, that's fine, but it doesn't matter whether or not the people working in your factory live in India or whether or not they live in the town next over. Ultimately, what's going to produce that wealth is going to be the fact that you were able to turn that labor into a commodity. So, it's compatible obviously both with the imperialistic model and the one that you're suggesting. So those are my two comments there. As an additional measure, just to kind of front the idea that imperialism is at least the most dominant form, I think it's covered in Lenin's imperialism, the highest state of capitalism. It doesn't matter the fact that other countries or even small individuals or even laborers own shares in a union or a company, or own it in a company or stocks in a company. The point is who has the controlling share. Who was it that said, I forget, I think it was even somebody in this room that said, one of the interesting things they tried is they bought stock in a company and then tried to show up at a stockholders meeting to help make decisions. Yeah, you know what happened to them? They got kicked out, right? It's worth pointing out, just because, other companies are integrated in the market to merely just sustain themselves in a capitalistic model, whether it be global or imperialist, doesn't mean that they have the controlling share or the controlling interest.
Right.
There's also another point to be made as well, which is just because it's in a company's national interest to be capitalist, doesn't mean that it's protecting the nation itself, right? Which I hope is not the claim that you're making.
No.
Oh, okay, good.
I think the opposite.
Yeah.
I think nationalism is just in a weird way. It's kind of like a thing of the past. It's still used. It's used rhetorically often, That's why GE, even though they didn't pay taxes, made all that money, still says, oh, we have to cut jobs because we have to be competitive. We're good for the nation and all these things. It's just rhetorical, But I think though nationalism still exists, that politics are still organized nationally. Capitalism is increasingly being organized globally. And I just think that, therefore, it's going in that direction. I'm not saying nations are going to be gone in RP, but it's going. Oh, yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, cool, thank you. I think that nations will continue to exist in some form or another. I'm saying that this is the end for nations, and this day America is the strongest country anymore, necessarily. They're up there, but now it's just the people who run the corporations within America or within wherever, the global systems.
But what makes America powerful now then? Or what made it powerful 70 years ago? Was it the actual nation itself? Or was it the same exact situation you're describing now? Which is...
Globalization basically changed in the 70s. And that's pretty much a well-documented thing. Like the current form of contemporary globalization changed. Obviously, look at the Silk Road, right? Obviously things have been, they've integrated across, at least large geographical locations since, before the dawn of history, really. Before writing, things like that. So I'm not saying that this is the first time where there's global exchange, but it has changed since the 70s, the way that capitalism has been arranged. And though 70 years ago, it seems to me, and this is just my take on it, is that America became strong because we were so rich. We were a capitalist country. We had money. It was about the nation. But now they've change. You know, with that, we can be working within that closed contained environment. And that's when we got worker rights. That's when we started saying, you know what, you can't just push us. We will have strikes and we will get our rights. And we did so. And, you know, they weren't making as much money. They had to play by our rules to some extent, as much as our rules. Globalization allowed them to skip those. You know, they're like, really? You know, you're going to strike? We're going to China. You know, sorry. You know, and that's just the way it's kind of going at this point.
But wouldn't you say there's a substantial difference between the idea of building a factory in China and going to China? Because the money hasn't really gone to China. The money stays here.
I don't think it stays here.
They're putting the blood in China. That's where they put the product.
Money stays within the people who own corporations.
I think China has the money, we have the debt.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the other way around. Like,
You know, I think America is still a wealthy country, despite the debt concept, you know. Huh? Well, you know, I think we're still strong, but I think that the corporations are the ones who are making all the money. Look how, we saw another deficit last year, you know, we're losing, the country itself is losing money, and yet corporate profits last year were better than ever. You know?
You said really well in your armaments are one of the biggest, you know, topics that make we sell throughout the world. Everybody.
You know, those
Armaments from
when Israel bombed Lebanon,
you know, Halberd,
when Israel bombed Lebanon a couple of years ago, dropped all those bombers, those illegal cluster bombs on the border of where we left, they was all set. That's one of the things. I think it's a good one.
Is it possible that globalization is just a natural evolution due to technology? Due to the fact that we can communicate, we can trade money overseas, we can ship things so fast. But how can we, I mean, it's inevitable that we're going to be doing this internationally, there's going to, you know. But is there a way that we can use it to our advantage and make it a good thing? You know what I mean?
No, I think so. Technology has.
By bringing third world countries up to a sustainable level.
That's good.
Right.
Good shit you brought up,
Definitely.
dude.
But capitalism is not equipped to do that. And globalization, though, is occurring in way more forms than just economic. You know, you can find punk rock bands anywhere in the world. You know? Although there's more things than just economics, economics is pushing capitalism, is pushing globalization because they actually make something. So I guess the question of can we make it better? Can we make it sustainable? Can we lift everybody up? I think without a doubt. I think what's important to make that happen is that should be a goal, not just have an ideological belief of, well, it'll just happen as long as we're free.
Yeah, I was just going to say as an idea of how globalization's providing the, you know, I guess the grave diggers of its own system is, I mean, well, first off, there's the Middle Eastern Revolution, which it wasn't just one country, it's throughout. And I mean, while obviously the Facebook thing's been played up way more than it deserved to be, it certainly was something. I mean, the reality is that we have, you know, Karl Marx talks about how means of communication improving are one of the main reasons why the working class can be an international class. You know, and I think that there's never been a time we've had more international communication than we have now. I think now, as far as, I don't know if I agree with the decentralization aspect, but I definitely agree with the fragmentation aspect of what you're talking about, because the reality is, they've taken everything, they've broken them up into different countries. And this is a bad thing in the sense they can use it as a blunt instrument against the working class, I guess, to break up unions, which is what they did, although it does actually hurt their long-term profitability. But the thing is that what this also provides is the ability for international unions. I mean, the reality is there was a time where there's no, like, you know, IWW, they were 100 years too soon, because the reality is there's really no possibility of international unions in 1902, you know? Like in 2011, it's almost impossible to not have them. It's almost like we can't even win without international unions. You know? And so and that's one thing that we should be in the unions pushing for, is creating international alliances with other unions, trying to form in bigger, you know, wider international, with internationalist policies. So, yeah, I don't know. I guess that these are all things that the working class has never been larger, despite maybe you've heard that working class has disappeared. The reality is that production workers have grown by leaps and bounds, just not in the United States, you know. And so, I mean, all these things really, they're all pointing to the end of Rome, you know. So,
Yeah, let's just stipulate that you're correct about there being a global capitalist class. What does the decline of the United States under a system of imperialism look like, and how is that different from the decline under the thesis that you're suggesting?
I'm saying that imperialism is it's just proceeding rampantly. I'm just saying it's not American imperialism. It's a global capitalist imperialism. It's an ideological imperialism, more so than it's just national imperialism. America is still one of, if not the richest capitalist class. So capitalist country. So we will see the agendas of that capitalist class expressed through our nation and the way we go. But I do believe that it is ultimately going to, once they recognize that America no longer is, that they can't, America's a tool, basically. This nation is a tool for this class, as I see it. And they use it, and they pay for it. And they write these hefty checks out just so they make sure that they can use it. It's like having a lawyer, a good lawyer. You know, they pay for the lawyer keeps them out of trouble, or, you know, they can do whatever they want, the lawyer gets them out of trouble. You know, that's kind of the good thing. I just think, I think that imperialism, though, is still
Yeah, I mean, it would seem to me then that instead of the sort of imperialistic models where, for instance, we can even sound intelligible by saying something like, oh, well, the Philippines is the new sweatshop of the world, that things like that would no longer even be intelligible to say. But it seems to me like that's almost still very much the case.
Well, we're still arranging around nations.
Right, but here's the thing is, if there's a global imperialist class, it seems to me like there would be a sort of unifying method by which one class would be dominating another class, but then that would supersede all national lines. So if that were more so the case, then we would be talking about sort of like internal oppressed nationalities. Like, for instance, you would talk about how, you know, the capitalists are exploiting the Kurds or something like that. The thing is, it doesn't seem to me like we're talking about it like that yet. And, like, we're still talking about on a very national level, and I think, I mean, like, I hate to just drive this home again, but it seems to me like imperialism is still the dominant mode. I mean, there might even be arguments for this being emerging as something that's in a tendency, but I don't think merely because the United States is losing power from a sort of global stance, that it's just not going to be a new imperialistic power from an imperialistic standpoint. I mean, the gentleman over here made it quite clearly, right? Who is it that owns all the money? Is it China or the United States? That's not a question that would appear if yours was mainly at hand. You know, and you know, it's worth also pointing out when Marx first started writing about capitalism, he wasn't writing about it necessarily from a nationalistic perspective of imperialism. That was Lenin that brought that. And you'll notice that it wouldn't have made sense to talk about that as much from a Marxian standpoint when he wrote that, but it did when Lenin was. And his, of course, speculation is that it was the last stage of capitalism. So,
no, I think you're right. And once again, I think Greg and I think everybody else made it clear that if I said something about how it has superseded national religions, I think I'm thinking more in terms of trends. I think it's heading that way. I think right now, though, there's still definitely spheres of influence being carved all over the world. Imperialism nationally also still does exist. I just think that that the ideological idea of capitalism itself is quickly becoming, if it hasn't succeeded, it is on its way to becoming the most dominant imperialist movement.
Absolutely.
But yes, it's still right. Absolutely.
But I mean, I think this very much goes back to a question that was at the heart of the discussion about 100 years ago. If you keep in mind, 100 years ago, you had had more or less peace in Europe because of the concert of Europe from about 1814, which went until about 1914, in which case the imperialists unleashed the most bloody war in the history of the world. And there were two theses. There was the thesis of imperialism, which was no, it was still concrete nation states that were engaging in violence and oppression and investment. And if there was any peace between them, it was just a covering over of those differences that would later, under the very pressure of these national interests, explode into the floor, which concretely they did through World War I. The secondary thesis was, and that was Lenin, the secondary thesis was posed by Trotsky, which is actually very similar to the thesis being pushed here, which is no, what was going to emerge would be ultra-imperialism, which is above imperialism, which is to say an elite capitalist class, irrespective of nations, then dominating the working class of the entire world. And the reason why he said this is, look, we've had peace for this long, and there's capitalist consolidation, and there's consolidation across all lines. Now, I mean, there's a strong reason to believe in this consolidation, or this trend of consolidation, going from 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, to about 2001. But in 2001, I think we see a clear break in which this trend, much like the trend of consolidation of the last century, breaks down, which is you have the United States as a nation state acting unilaterally against the world governing bodies. You have the exclusion based on national interest, i.e. France and Germany were excluded from the exploitation of Iraq. And even more so, I mean, if the transnational class is to be taken, then what is to be said of, say, Russia and South Ossetia, or Russia and Ukraine? Is that a different transnational class? And if it is, what gives it the constitution that's hostile to the other emerging transnational class?
Yeah, I just wanted to posit maybe, like I understand and I do agree with a lot of the rest of what you're saying, but maybe posit the idea that instead of saying like a transnational capitalist class, more like a transnational capitalist system. You know, I mean globalization. Like I really think these are all constituent parts of. They all have their own independent national interests. I think that if you saw like one World Bank, I mean I know there's a World Bank, but it's not one World Bank. If you have one World Bank that really represents one currency, that really represents, you know, if you have, you know, I don't know. It's like these are not the. While it seems like that, I'm not saying it's not possible. At some point, all kinds of bizarre transformations have happened. But I would say, in many ways, one of the problems in my view of capitalism is not that it's too monolithic. It's that it is too decentralized. It exists. There's no plan. There's no ability to actually.
Central regulation.
Yeah, you can't regulate things, and even when they have regulation, I think Vonner's definition of regulation. I couldn't really quite hear it, but as far as regulation goes, you can't regulate what you don't own. And the reality is, I mean, they actually can to an extent, but when it comes down to it, you know, the reality is that these governments are all just counting the people who actually own these things. So that's why the regulations isn't generally being milquetoast or non-existent. So, but I don't know. So I guess that's my idea. Is maybe viewing it more as globalization as a system, and because I think down the line, we're already seeing. Greg's talking about some of these conflicts that have already emerged. I think we're going to see much more, and we're going to see much deadlier conflicts that emerge. And we won't be able to understand it unless we understand that they're buying capitalist, national capitalist interests. So,
I think another thing that backs up your point too is I read this book called Investment of the Economic Freedom. But yeah, we're seeing everyone think that all around the world. But a lot of these companies that are giving out loans specifically go to like third world countries and have their exports there. So that just kind of shows that. And they would do that because tax reasons and stuff like that. So it wasn't like a national interest or a little war or something. So they were just doing whatever was convenient for them.
So they do things national. Yeah, exactly. And then we can also just say internationally, we're global. Right. We're basically global. It just depends on that. The only consistency is the motive of changing from one to the other.
Yeah, two things I wanted to mention. Maybe one that strengthens your thesis, and then maybe one that detracts from it a little bit. The first is that, you know, obviously as a materialist, I would want to see some sort of emerging evidence of this. I think there is actually maybe one or two little things. Recently, there was a pact between Brazil, India, and China saying that they would no longer use U.S. dollars to trade between their countries, and that they would use their own currency. Like, in a certain way, what this does is it makes it so that the banks in the United States don't necessarily have potentially controlling interests in those countries. If that's the case, that creates a little breathing space for those countries to develop their own national powers that are different, although still competing with the United States. So that's potentially a supporting point. I don't think that arguments about the World Bank or the IMF, I think Greg's point's taken very well on that side. But I do think there might be some different evidences. But on the flip side of that same argument, what makes it so compelling in the imperialistic model is that it's all banks, and with money, regardless if it's traded in quail feathers or in dollars or in gold cubes or whatever, is that you can purchase it anywhere across the world. And to ignore the notion of monopoly and the practices of things like outlined in shock doctrine or other accidents would to kind of ignore the weakness of these older countries or these weaker countries and the ability of other countries to merely just move in financially and dominate those people in monopoly. And, you know, I'm not sure what type of argument would have to be made in order to argue against the monopolistic nature of capitalism, but you would need to do something along the lines of that. The other is a more radical thesis I just came up with in my head, which is the actual anti-imperialism and global domination via imperialism, or the competition of that, is actually a fascistic national trend. Which is to say, the only way you can really make it so the United States or another dominant country has the ability to do that is if you install a strong national pride and you refuse to do business with them. And then now what are we looking at? Capitalism can still operate in a country like that. It doesn't even need to necessarily be capitalism. But in order to resist domination of imperialism, you're going to have to express a lot of isolationism and a refusal of international capital, which, you know, can lead both ways. I mean, in some ways that might look like, you know, Germany or something like that in the Third Reich. It could also look like Cuba. Cuba also refuses to be, like, it does have to do business with the rest of the world. It isn't, I mean, in a certain way it's nationalistic, but obviously in a very different socialist sense. But
I agree with that.
also, you may want to be careful about what you say about Cuba in Cuba.
Thank you. Yeah, I decided not to write out about Cuba. I don't know enough to actually say specifically. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Okay, well, I appreciate you guys and all your feedback, and allowing me the opportunity to be up here and have this